Okay, let's dive in. We've got some really thought-provoking source material today.
Mm.
It's arguing that the biggest challenge we're facing isn't really about technology or, societal breakdown.
Right, or even just a lack of information.
Exactly. It's something, well, much more fundamental. They're calling it a cognitive crisis, a slow erosion of meaning and consciousness itself.
And it presents this fascinating kind of paradoxical idea that humanity could become functionally automated, basically running on autopilot.
While still appearing intelligent. So the surface looks okay.
Yeah, the surface seems fine, but the deeper structure, the internal landscape, that's what they say is collapsing.
Okay. So our mission in this deep dive is really to unpack what these sources claim is happening.
Hmm.
We need to explore how it connects to, well, some heavy hitters like Nietzsche's ideas on the herd instinct, examine the maybe surprising and perhaps kind of alarming role AI plays in amplifying all this.
And then look at this specific theory. It's called Odam Tili, which is put forward as a potential way to, well, navigate out of this crisis.
Right. So we're going straight to the heart of these sources, trying to understand their core argument. They seem to believe something is fundamentally changing our collective mind, our language even.
And it's a problem of structural organization, they argue, not just surface issues that we usually talk about.
All right, let's jump into what the material identifies as the core problem then. This breakdown of consciousness and meaning. It kicks off by looking back at the philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche.
Yeah, and the sources, they don't treat Nietzsche's herd instinct as just, simple groupthink or conformity.
No.
They frame it as something much deeper, a kind of psychological tendency, almost a moral pathology is how they put it. Something Nietzsche really feared was poised to just overcome individual will, authentic self-expression.
And this tendency, they argue, has gotten incredibly good at, well, camouflaging itself. The sources list examples to call them false virtue, masking the actual mechanism underneath.
Right.
Like the concept of compassion. It can sometimes be a disguise for a deeper fear of differentiation. Fear of standing out, being different.
Precisely. And they point to others too. Equality, for example, potentially masking an erasure of excellence.
Okay.
Or even solidarity, perhaps concealing a suppression of truth. It's suggesting these values, which seem really positive on the surface, can actually, in certain contexts, become tools that enforce sameness and, well, stifle genuine individual expression.
And the consequence of that. If this perspective holds water, this drift towards psychological sameness, it actively erodes our capacity for autonomous judgment, for thinking truly independently.
That's the argument. It diminishes the courage needed to question the accepted narrative, and it weakens what they even suggest is like a biological drive towards authentic self-expression.
Wow. Okay.
And this is where AI, maybe surprisingly, enters the picture, according to these sources. They argue it's not just passively reflecting us.
Wow.
It's actively scaring the systemic errors that are already present in our collective human behavior.
Because the sources challenge a core myth about AI, right? They state pretty plainly, AI doesn't think like a human.
Exactly. Its power isn't thought, it's prediction. Based on vast data sets of existing behavior, essentially, the aggregated patterns of the herd, to use that term again.
So if our collective data, our digital footprint, contains cognitive flaws or, say, linguistic imprecision or patterns of suppressing dissenting views.
The AI doesn't correct those errors, it learns them, it reproduces them. So a cognitive error that's embedded in the data can quickly become an amplified cultural norm. Linguistic sloppiness gets hard-coded into the system.
And the suppression of dissent.
That can be made almost invisible, hidden under this neutral-sounding label of algorithmic optimization.
Right. There's a line in the material that really kind of hammers this home for me. AI does not liberate us from human error. It reproduces that error at machine speed.
Yeah. It really makes you pause and wonder, doesn't it?
Right.
If our own errors are just being reproduced and amplified constantly at machine speed, is this truly advancement?
Or is it, like the sources suggest, a fundamental systemic threat to the very evolution of human intelligence itself?
It's a heavy question.
And the sources argue this vulnerability, this tendency towards, let's say, programmed behavior, it begins surprisingly early. They bring in Dr. Mahmudjon Kuchkarov's warning from back in 2020, specifically about education.
Right. Dr. Kuchkarov's critique, it really centers on standardization within modern education systems. He sees it as performing a kind of psychological standardization.
Psychological standardization.
Yeah. Almost like a subconscious attempt to correct, quote unquote, what he calls God's programming.
I found his analogy here really striking. He compares unique human beings described as being handcrafted, like fingerprints, each one totally distinct, to mass-produced machines. He argues, mass production is for machines. Humans weren't designed to be identical copies.
And following this pattern, society then effectively mass produces personality, creating these uniform ways of thinking, behaving, believing.
So the outward symbols might change later on national flags, political slogans, whatever.
Exactly. But the underlying psychological configuration, which was set by that standardized early education, it's already in place. It's baked in.
The material's conclusion here is pretty stark, then. Modern education, they claim, isn't primarily designed to train intelligence.
But to configure compliance, that's the argument.
Maybe the most unsettling part is that, according to this perspective, once this configuration is internalized, it feels completely indistinguishable from your own genuine will.
Yeah. It feels like your thoughts, your beliefs, even though they might have been, from this viewpoint, psychologically programmed, it just feels natural.
So all these threads, the herd instinct, AI amplifying errors, education configuring compliance, they argue this leads to what they call a foundational rupture.
A foundational rupture.
Meaning?
Humanity has, in a sense, lost control of its own language.
Lost control of language. How so? Well, the symptoms are all around us, they suggest. Speaking in borrowed phrases, just regurgitating old ideas, giving these pre-programmed reactions to complex situations.
Okay, I see.
Language, they argue, has stopped being this vibrant tool of unique, authentic expression.
And they define this new state pretty precisely, don't they? Language becomes content.
Meaning is now product.
And thought functions merely as an interface.
Yeah, so the goal isn't truth or genuine connection anymore. It's optimization. For likes, for shares, for algorithmic visibility. You know the drill.
And without language that's rooted in our sensory experiential reality, what it actually feels like to be a sensing living human being, consciousness itself starts to fragment.
We speak words, but the connection to what they actually mean for us individually is severed.
So we're speaking for the system, essentially, not from our own being.
And the sources tie this right back to Nietzsche, seeing it as the final stage of his deepest fear. The voluntary, almost unnoticed death of the authentic self.
Because if your language isn't truly yours, can yourself be either? That's a chilling thought.
It really is.
Yeah.
Which raises this huge question. Is there any way to reverse this profound semantic decay?
And this is where the sources introduce Dr. Kuchkarov's proposed counter-theory. It's called Odam Tili, which translates roughly to the human language code.
And they present Odam Tili not as, philosophical speculation.
No, not at all. It's presented as a scientific, empirically derived linguistic model. It's described almost like linguistic engineering, a method for rebuilding language and thought from the ground up.
Linguistic engineering.
Yeah.
Okay. What are its core components?
Well, first, there are these phonosemantic codes. The idea is that every individual sound we make, every phoneme, has a primary sensory or emotional origin that existed way before complex grammar.
So like the sound itself has meaning.
Kind of, yeah. Think about the S sound. Maybe it evokes the hiss of a snake, something quiet, slithery, or the Y sound, perhaps the sound of flowing water, something smooth. The idea is these aren't random.
They suggest deep biological roots for language in our sensory experience.
Exactly. Long before abstract rules. Second is cognitive synchronization. Odam Tili aims to bring sound, meaning derived from those sensory roots, and even physical interaction back into alignment.
Trying to restore language's connection to its biological foundations.
Yeah.
Which contrasts sharply with theories that treat language as just an abstract system, right?
Precisely. And this leads to the third component, which they call reversal of semantic decay. By reconstructing language from these original sound-meaning pairings, Odam Tili offers a practical blueprint, a method for rebuilding thought itself layer by layer from its most foundational elements.
So it's presented as a way to reclaim language and therefore potentially reclaim authentic thought and consciousness.
That's the claim. And Dr. Kuchkarov uses some powerful imagery to critique how our current sense of identity is often manufactured. The sources mention his analogy about a flag.
Oh, yeah, I remember that, where he describes a flag as just a child's undergarment.
Right. Saying that empires kill for it, but ultimately it's just a piece of cloth used to claim your fate by telling you you were born under this specific symbol.
His point isn't to deny identity entirely, is it?
No, not at all. It's to expose the manufacturer of it. The nations, the slogans, the external symbols we're often told are who we are, fundamentally.
When our true nature, from this Odam Tili perspective, is something much more fundamental. We are sensory, linguistic, cognitive beings, first and foremost.
And the sources make a pretty powerful claim here. We are being erased, they argue, not through violence or conquest in the traditional sense.
But through this synthetic sameness, this mass-produced identity and way of thinking.
Exactly. That's the danger they highlight.
So, pulling all of this together then, the sources really don't mince words at the end. They conclude this isn't just some academic theory, it's describing a systems collapse that's already in motion.
Yeah, their warning is stark. If we continue to ignore this fundamental decline in cognition, if we keep believing that AI enhances minds that are already conditioned for compliance,
And if we persist in treating language as just data points, rather than the living essence of meaning,
then they argue the collapse of organized human society isn't just a distant possibility anymore. It becomes a kind of historical certainty.
Yeah.
And potentially irreversible.
wow, that's quite the conclusion.
And according to the sources we've looked at today, only one theory is currently presented that even attempts to address this crisis at this deep root level.
And that's Odam Tili.
That's Odam Tili.
Okay, well, that is definitely a lot to process. This whole idea that the most significant threat we face is internal, it's to the very structure of our own minds, the nature of our language.
We've traveled through Nietzsche's concerns about conformity, seen how AI might amplify our cognitive weaknesses,
Explored how education can potentially configure compliance.
and witnessed the potential for this semantic collapse where language loses its connection to, well, reality.
And then we've been introduced to Odam Tili as this challenging but potentially vital counter-theory, offering a method, maybe, to reverse that semantic decay and rebuild thought from its foundational links between sound and meaning.
It's a radical proposition, really.
So, confronted with all of this, where do you, the listener, even begin? The sources themselves offer a starting point, a provocative question to leave you with.
Yeah, they suggest you begin right here. Consider this question. What is your language actually made of?
What is your language made of? And they do suggest that exploring the model designed to answer that question might be the next step, pointing towards resources like the Odam Tili Academy for anyone interested in diving deeper.
It's really an invitation, isn't it, for all of us to look inward and reflect on these profound, often hidden connections between our language, our thoughts.
And the fundamental challenges that are shaping our modern world. Definitely something to mull over.